Good morning, RockFish Church. It's good to see you guys here today. Thank you guys for joining us online. Guys, if it's your first time here and you snuck in past us, we didn't get an opportunity to introduce ourselves. I'd love to meet you up after the service. I'll meet you right up here, talk to you. But we have a welcome center right on the other side of this wall that they would love to get to know you. They'd ask you for a little bit of information, but we have a gift ready for you. We want to make you feel at home and welcome here. But we are getting into our second week of our 5-week sermon series, Rebuild. And we're in the book of Nehemiah all month long. So if you want to know what you should be reading this month to kind of stay up on this stuff, I would encourage you, go ahead and read Nehemiah as a whole. Last week we talked through chapter 1. Today we'll be in chapter 2 if you want to get your Bibles ready for that. We will sneak back into chapter 1 for just a second today. But this sermon series, leaning on the book of Nehemiah, is happening roughly about 450 years before the birth of Christ. And so this is taking time during a time of exile. Nehemiah is not living in Jerusalem or in Judah where he belongs as an Israelite. God has allowed them to be exiled, and he actually works as the cupbearer for the Persian king Artaxerxes. And so for those history buffs or those that are trying to learn some history, Artaxerxes is the son of the king Xerxes that you see in the Battle of Thermopylae. And so this is, just one generation removed from that, about 450 years before Christ. And so in this position of being a cupbearer, he's a slave. He's been exiled into this country, into this kingdom he doesn't belong in. But for whatever reason, he's trustworthy enough to be placed in the position of cupbearer. So the king has put him in a position where he is the guy that makes sure that nothing that doesn't belong in that cup doesn't belong in that cup or doesn't get into that cup, ensuring that the king is not being poisoned by his drinks. So he's in a trusted position, and he has daily access to the king because of his position. So there's some kind of rapport they have with each other, which we're going to see here in chapter 2. And so it's something to note that he's got that relationship, allowing for what we're going to see today. All right, but today's focus is on taking responsibility. What we're going to see here with Nehemiah is he finds himself in a position in chapter 1 that he is not responsible for having got himself into, but yet he has participated in, he has settled for, and he has been okay with up until this point. And so what he does, his response, is to take responsibility for the situation. He's not looking for who's at fault. He's sharing the blame. He's sharing the accountability. He says, you know what? God has opened my eyes to this. I'm going to respond accordingly. And so when we look at Nehemiah, if you have a Bible that offers little teachings about each book before you open it, like you get to the first page of Genesis, it tells you who wrote it, when was it written, and who is the audience, right? Yada, yada, all those things. Same thing in the book of Nehemiah. If you go to any Bible that gives you that kind of information, they're going to credit him as being a leader. They're going to talk about his qualities and his characteristics as being that of a leader. And so he is highly regarded for his leadership qualities, but I think it's who he is that allows that leadership to shine through. It's worth noting that because of his position as cupbearer, he's around a king all the time. He has the ability to glean do's and don'ts about leadership on a daily basis as the king is interacting with his subjects and his trusted men. So he's witnessing these things. It doesn't show us anywhere in here that he had some aspirations of somehow being a leader at some point, but in his proximity to leadership, he was learning a lot, and I think that's evident in how he responds to what occurs here. And so while he's regarded as a talented leader, one of the greatest characteristics he has is his willingness to follow and submit to those that are over him. He's trusted in this position for a reason. God is using him for a reason. It doesn't matter that he hasn't been a military leader or a spiritual leader or whatever. He's been given a gift to lead because he's been submitting to authority in a proper and honoring way. All right, so this focus on him accepting the responsibility for his situation is key because that's not typical human behavior. What do we usually do? We look for the person to share as much blame or all of the blame as possible instead of ourselves. Now, he was in a position where it wasn't his fault, but he saw the guilt that he had to take on, and it allowed him to excel in this position, in this role. And so we need to recognize that what he's doing is not typical human behavior, let alone Israelite behavior or any Christian behavior. This is not normal. And just his willingness to take responsibility is a huge factor here, which is why we're spending a weekend on it. So this problem for us, what it does when we don't respond like Nehemiah, when we aren't willing and assertive in taking responsibility for certain situations, when we're looking for others to blame and take accountability and responsibility for something, that holds us back. When we recognize there's something wrong in our marriage and we expect the other person to bend and fix it. When we recognize something wrong with the family in general, or maybe at work or in the community, or I don't like the way my church does this, it looks like it's sin, it looks like we're doing something wrong here, and we're waiting on somebody else to address it. We're not taking responsibility for the situation. It holds us back, not to mention everybody else that's impacted by what's going on, and especially in our personal walk. So I was talking with somebody recently, lovely person. My heart was broken for them. They were in this horrible situation where they'd been cheated on, lied to about being cheated on, and then got left, and the two that were cheating are now in a relationship. And this person was dependent. She's going to a counselor, and the counselor's like, well, what you need is closure. You're not going to get it from the two people that were perfectly fine, betraying you, lying to you, and going about their lives like nothing happened. See, she has to take responsibility and say, you know what, I'm not going to allow my joy to be affected by these other people. I'm not going to allow how I respond to this situation to be dictated by what these other people are willing to do and give me to console me in my grief. She's grieving. And the only person in this situation that's going to be able to give her what she needs is her deciding to take responsibility for that situation. It wasn't her fault. She's a victim of the evil of other people. But she's going to be stuck in that grief, not moving forward, not growing spiritually until she decides, you know what? My God said I can be healed. My God said I'm whole without this other person. My God said that I'm valuable enough that I'm a daughter of the Most High God, and He's my Father, and His heart is broken for me, and He wants to restore me. Until that person is ready to receive that and walk that out, until they take responsibility for their condition, they'll continue, unfortunately, in their grief. And so our grief or our general emotional state affects us to the point where we get in this fog or confusion, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do because we're so busy grieving. We're looking for the exit door, but we can't find it. We're in this fog. We're blinded by it. And so the only way out is take responsibility for the situation. Otherwise, we're waiting on somebody else to take responsibility. And that is really difficult when we're waiting on somebody else and they're not engaged in the problem at all. The problem is with us, we're just smart enough to get ourselves in a little bit more trouble. We're just clever enough to think we can outsmart the system every once in a while. There's something within us that just knows if I avoid taking responsibility, I won't be held accountable. If I don't take responsibility, somebody else will finally step up. They'll be the ones held accountable for the progress or the failure that it follows. The problem is if we are failing to take responsibility, we can't expect anyone else to do it as well. All we know is our eyes are open to it. As far as we know, we're the only ones that see the problem, so we have to take responsibility instead of waiting. The thing with responsibility, somebody else can't force it on you, and you can't force it on them. So we get to a standstill. So nothing's getting done in this predicament where you don't want to do anything first, I don't want to do anything first. Nothing's getting done. There is a stagnation. There's a stoppage in the growth, in the development, the maturing, and the spiritual walk for each one of us. What is currently an amazing opportunity for you in your life when you experience that grief and you have the opportunity to take responsibility, when you don't do that, you're missing out on a great opportunity to grow spiritually, to level up, to increase, to seek out God and see what he has for you in that situation. So regardless of what you get today, remember this, that God will never hold somebody else accountable for what was your responsibility. He will never punish anybody else for not fulfilling what was your responsibility. And when he shows it to you that it's wrong, that it's evil, that it's taking you away from God, that it's screwing up a godly relationship, your eyes have been opened. You have to take responsibility. All right, so this is where we find Nehemiah. We're going to skip back to chapter 1 just for a second. We're going to go to verses 4 through 6. And what we're about to read here is him immediately doing one thing that allows for the second thing to take place. And so by his taking ownership of the problem, it allows him to take the initiative for the solution. Right? So if he just is witnessing the problem but doesn't take ownership, there's no reason for him to engage in the solution. But because he took responsibility, all of a sudden now this second opportunity arises for him to take the initiative to fix what's wrong. So big change is often going to occur because of big decisions. We got to make those hard decisions if we want to see change. So you see, he was grieving, he was full of sorrow for the condition of his people, of the city, of the legacy, the relationship that was supposed to be currently in good, right standing with God that wasn't. He's grieving this. And so taking that ownership is what allowed the possibility for this next step. So we see I'm going to read through verses 4 through 6 here. It says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. He is not saying, look, those guys are really guilty and I'm a little bit guilty. He's lumping himself in. He said, you know what? I'm just as guilty. He recognizes that I have allowed myself to sit in a not right place with you, to be in sin, to be content with it. I've been okay with this decent position I've been given in this new kingdom instead of the perfect right position that you offer me in the kingdom we already had. So he realized in the military, we would use this phrase, he realized they as a culture, them as a people, had lost the initiative. And in this situation, they had taken God so for granted that they didn't need to be ambushed by an enemy. They'd already kicked the door open, put their feet up, and they were just waiting for it to happen. They took the day off, and they took God for granted, and they just let the devil walk in and do what he wanted to do. And God said, you know what? You people are so lukewarm for me. You people are so dependent on me without giving me any praise or worship, without having any actual relationship. You come and give mild offerings. You do the thing, but there's nothing going on in here. I'm going to let you be in exile for a while. I'm going to let you experience a fraction of what eternity will be like because of your behavior with me. So he sees all this, he's grieved by it, and what he decides to do is retake the initiative that had been lost in the first place by his people. The next step is to seek authority and provision for permission. So as we continue to read, we're going to see in a very short amount of time, there's no great storytelling ability here going on in chapter 2. He is succinct and to the point as he's telling us what's going on. And so it immediately follows as he's still grieving, that he's sad in his heart. He's full of sorrow. He didn't just, I want to point this out real quick. He didn't just say, you know what, I'm so grieved by this. I'm taking responsibility for this. I'm taking the initiative. I'm moving out. He recognized there was two authorities over him. He had the king and he had God. And if he wanted to be fruitful in any of these things, if he wanted to be able to make it outside the gates of the city he was currently in without losing his head, he needed to submit to authority and ask for the provisions. He needed to ask for permission. He didn't just say, you know what, well, one of the traits I have, and I know a lot of other people have, is when I see, I've got a job to do. I get paid to do a thing. But the routine is just not fun sometimes. And we lose momentum and we lose a little interest and we're looking for anything. And the second the shiny thing pops up over here that's somebody else's responsibility that allows me to get out of my chair and go help them, I'm doing it. I will let my grass grow tall in my yard to go help somebody else with a project in theirs. It's all good and well. But you don't get to just trade responsibility for one thing for another on your own. He's recognizing the authority over the situation. And so in his honoring of authority, it honors him back. So he's looking for, through God, the spiritual permission, and through the king, legal permission and provision to carry out this task that's just weighing on his heart. He doesn't take the typical response, or at least play it out like I would have maybe. He doesn't go against the grain. And so here we go. We're going to go Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 5. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now previously, I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. What he's saying is, look, king, I'm not, I got no beef with you. I'm not rising up against you. I got no issue. My sorrow is related to something different. No disrespect, but you asked, I'm going to let you know what's going on. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, he said, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now think about this. He didn't go let me run off to my prayer closet and do 30 minutes of prayer. He's immediately engaging God in this conversation. He prays in an instant to God, and he immediately asked the king following that. He said, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. So his humility before God and the king allows a generous and graceful response, right? But if he had gotten a chip on his shoulder and he made it I got this project to do, y'all you hold me back. I got this, you're making me come here and serve wine. I got greater things to do. My people's city is in shambles. I need to go do this thing. It's a higher calling. I'm going about my business. He didn't run off and do the thing. He didn't have a chip on his shoulder. He's extremely humble. He recognizes that he needs to be released from his current role and position and responsibility to take on a different one. See, because humility opens the doors for us. It allows somebody to return with a gentle, kind, generous response. But if he had that arrogance or entitlement about what was due him and what God had called him to do, then we're not going to see the same response likely. So listen to the exchange that follows after his humble approach. So how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleases the king to send me when I had given him a time. So how long are you going to be gone? What do you need to do? Okay. He gives him a time, pleases the king. And as I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river. When he says beyond the river, he's talking about beyond the Euphrates, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked for. The good hand of God was upon me. So not only is he being released because he asked in the right way and he sought authority and recognized authority, submitted himself. Not only is he being released, he's being sent. Not only is he being sent, he's being sent with what he needs. He's even got the courage to ask for, can you send me these other things to make sure I make it from point A to point B without being kidnapped, robbed, killed, whatever it may be. And he sends it. So he ends up being equipped, funded, and defended, which we'll see in a second here. So we learn a little bit more about the provision in verse 9. It says, then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. So he didn't just go off by himself. He went with a team of people sent to protect and work with him. It pretty significant for a king who's not under your God, has nothing to do with your religion, or doesn't care much for your city. So next we see the beginning of planning and preparation. All right, so he took responsibility and initiative. He submitted to the authorities and requested their permission and for provision. He's getting those things. And it should, again, there's nothing about the travel except what we've already read. And now he's at the location. We saw a little bit about the provision that's already been provided, but there's more coming. But he gets to the destination without telling everyone while he's there. He shows up quietly, discreetly. He doesn't sneak in, but he didn't show up like some grand parade, like, hey, look at me, I'm showing up. We got some cool project to do. So again, he's exercising wisdom, humility, and patience, but he gets down to business immediately. He's there for about 3 days. He knows he's given the king a clear timeline. You're letting me go, I'm going to be back by this day. So he knows he has a finite window to complete this. And so after 3 days, he goes out by night. It says, I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Now it continues. He gives us a few more details about what he sees and where he can and can't go because of the current dilapidated standard of the walls and the gates. But basically, he saw a couple more things and he comes back into the gate. And so what he did here, and again, he doesn't show up like, hey, all right, I saw what we need to do, and immediately go into it. There is at least some time has passed, but it doesn't give us an amount of time between his returning into the gate and the next step he'll do. But in this step, he is observing, he is assessing, and he is planning. He has to do those things before this next one can occur. And that next one is to cast vision. So once you've got a plan, you want to engage in something, you want to do something and accomplish something for the Lord, right? You've got to construct a plan. Otherwise, you're just a guy trying to gather people and we'll figure it out as we go along. That doesn't convince a lot of people that you know what you're doing and they should join in. So he establishes the plan within his own mind, maybe puts it on paper, whatever, but he creates the plan. And that allows him to build momentum. So as he casts this vision that we're about to see, he does it super simple. Again, he's not doing a great storytelling effort here. He gives us one statement. But in the next verse, he's casting this vision, laying out what should motivate people to become carriers of that same vision to the ultimate destination of the desired position. So he said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Now Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. He continues, it says, and I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. So what he did was he filled in the blanks for them. They already knew the status of everything there with the walls and the gates. They got it. They're just used to it. They're okay with it. Their eyes haven't been opened to the fact that this is related to their relationship to God and it needs restoration, right? Ultimately, it's symbolic, but there's a reason that he's being called to do this. And so he's filling in the blanks for them. He's like, look, I'm here to do this thing to get this symbol of pride and beauty and wonder that it has always been with God's presence here, to put it back into the level of care and maintenance that it should have been receiving all along. And so not only am I here to do that, but I've been permitted by the king. And let me tell you about how God's been blessing it all along the way. So he's filling in the blanks of what they don't see. So like, I'm not just the crazy guy that said, I'm going to go out, on a whim and do this. I've got permission. I've got funding. We've got the resources. If you want to be a part of this, when you look at what was a great city now in its deteriorated status, when you see that, if it bothers you in your heart, now's the time for us to take action. So he made them aware of the God element in this scenario. And when we make that connection between it just being something we want to do and something we see God is blessing us in doing, that does something to those we're trying to inspire to good works or provoke to good works. And so I would I would encourage you, question yourself, have you taken the time to recognize God's provision and permission in your life again and again? In the circumstances that led up all the way until today, but even in the moment, for those that are struggling with something right now, maybe with your personal walk, maybe in your relationship, maybe what you see in the community, do you recognize and celebrate God? Do you give him glory for all that he has done for permission and provision in your life already? So one of the things most leaders have to do, at some point you get some kickback, some pushback, some doubt being expressed. And so what he does here is he say, you know what? He's going to give them a pretty unique response, because sometimes we want to just bring everybody along. Let me talk you into why this is a good deal for you, right? But just like many leaders, he's encountering this, and what he's hearing is in verses 19 and 20. It says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They're looking to bring an accusation against them and say, why are you doing this thing? It's going to fail. You shouldn't be here. You should be trying to do this. You should shut up and go home, right? Now, his response is quite different than those of us who just want to bring people along. It says, then he replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. He said, this is what your derision and your mockery is going to get you. You will be left outside. Say, we will celebrate and we will enjoy the fruits of our labor and our following God's call in this situation, but you want no part, you're going to have no part. So instead of saying, look, come on over to my side, he just draws a clear line and says, stay where you are. So he didn't shy away from the hostility. He didn't just say to his crew, you know what, guys, hey, just ignore them, put your heads down, let's just continue to work. He addressed it head on. And when you're telling somebody you want to move with you, like when you're proclaiming God is moving in this situation and we have to follow, this is what he expects of us, this is what he's put us here for this time in this place. If you're declaring that thing, you better declare that to those that oppose you just as well. Do not shy away from declaring God's role and provision in your circumstance. So he proclaimed God's hand over the project. But always remember, you're always going to encounter somebody who's got something negative to say. It's probably going to be me. This is my personality, all right, being an Eeyore. You're always going to encounter somebody who's going to have some pushback, some doubt, and that when you say you're called by God, you better declare it, you better proclaim it with no shame, no fear, own it all the way to the end. Glorify him in the beginning, the middle, and the end of what you're doing. But if they're going to question your motives and your interests, you should too. Examine yourself before somebody even bothers to examine you. Know that what you're doing, be convinced and convicted that what you're doing is of God and for God. And it will only be accomplished by God. Ultimately, your call may not include their agenda, which is why you can draw that clear line between you and the opposition. So he's doing all these things, and all that leaves is to execute, to complete the plan, to get to work. And so it's right after his response, again, not a huge storyteller, right after that response, we go into chapter 3, first verse, it starts telling us all the things that are going on. Who's doing this? Who's doing that? Who's doing this? There's an annotation of everybody involved in this circumstance and where their gifts and their experience and their talents are being poured in to this ultimate project of restoring the walls and the gates. God logs it all there in chapter 3. Now, we're not going to cover chapter 3 next week, so I would encourage you this week, as you prepare for next week's sermon in chapter 4, go ahead and read through chapter 3. Continue the story. Be informed about all the things going on. But there's a chance we reference it. But what they didn't do is allow themselves to be paralyzed by analysis. They didn't have the whole paralysis analysis problem, right? He got them on board. He said, he cast the vision. We're going to address the doubt, and then they just get to work. They didn't wait. The problem with the analysis paralysis situation, guys, when we're talking about turning back to God, I mean, you can apply this thing to other things in life that need repair and attention, but when we're talking about turning people back to God, it's not complex. It's not. It is the simplest thing in the world to leave what you've been doing, to stop what you've been doing, to fall on your knees and ask God to forgive you and return you and restore you to the place where you belong. The complication comes in when we try and do it our way, when we try and want to have his vision and our vision too. The complication is the compromise we're trying to achieve between God's way and our way, God's timing and our timing. If you want to turn back to God, it is the simplest, not easiest, simplest thing to do. It gets complicated when you try and compromise with God about what his plan is and what you want to incorporate in that plan. So real quick, I want to talk about grief and its role in all of this. We're all going to experience grief at some point in our life, multiple times. I would hope that as it increases more and more, or maybe even more often, that we would handle it better and better, that we would be more talented and experienced. We would learn from what was good grieving, what was bad grieving, and we would continue to improve in that. But I want to talk about not just that it was important in this story, it got him moving in the first place, but that there's a proper place for grief given our circumstances. So in this instance, he wept and prayed and mourned and fasted for days. So we're talking about a city's walls that are down, burned, destroyed, but it's a city that's already controlled by an opposing force for people who are already slaves. Like, this was not the enemies marching to the gates and they're going to tear through and march right over us. That stuff already happened. Lives weren't at stake in the moment. And so he was afforded this opportunity to grieve in the moment for days on end, because days on end in the beginning was very small, insignificant compared to the project he was about to take on. He was about to build a house while he stayed there because it was going to be that intensive of a project. So this was not going to be some 3 days of mourning, we'll get it fixed in 3 days, right? So the ratio there matters. But the urgency or the lack of urgency in the situation, because lives weren't at stake, this is a symbolic thing to draw people back to God. Salvation was at stake. People being tied to God, people being in right standing with God, that's at stake. But lives weren't at stake, so he was afforded this opportunity to grieve beforehand. But when your boat is taking on water, you don't sit in the captain's seat and just cry about it, right? You get every spoon, bucket, and bowl you can find, and you start throwing water out of the boat because it's a little more urgent, right? When the house is on fire, you don't stand outside and pray and say, why, God, why? You get moving. You get everything that's living out of that house. There's an urgency that's with that, right? But the reality is some of us are going to be driven by our personality, and some of us out of necessity, to mourn in the beginning, to mourn in the middle, like doing the repairs, and mourning at the end, right? The grieving at the end. And so, for whatever reason, Nehemiah was afforded the opportunity to grieve on the front end, and it was what it took for that to rise up within him to say, I can't overlook this thing. I can't settle for it. I need to take responsibility for this situation. And so his godly sorrow produced godly change. So there's not anything wrong with him grieving on the front end, but it's not always appropriate. See, others, like I said, based on how we're made and what we've experienced, at the onset of grief, we get busy. And I don't mean like being a busy bee, but like we just know, hey, stuff needs to happen right now. Everybody else is falling apart. Everything else is falling apart. I need to be the one in control. We had a death in the family years ago, and it was the patriarch of the family, and all the women are just falling apart, like wailing, like they're tore up. They've known this man for 50, 60, 70 years, depending on their age. Some of them in their 40s. Now, there's an 18-year-old granddaughter at the time who just happens to be there when all this happens, and somehow she's able in her peace with God to not be so struck with mourning that she's able to manage everything going on as an 18-year-old. So this is not always about, again, Nehemiah was not a well-tested leader necessarily. In fact, it's almost a guarantee he wasn't. It's not about age and experience. It's about those who are convicted and know that, you know what, something needs to happen right now. Somebody's got to hold this thing together. Somebody's got to point everybody back to God in this circumstance. And so I would say, don't look to the oldest and the most experienced. Look to the one and allow the one who's being called to lead in that moment, allow them to lead. God gave them the vision for a reason. So is it best to grieve before, during, or after? And the question would be, or the answer is yes. But it's how and how much. It's what does the circumstance allow? How much more is going to be lost? Who else is going to lose their salvation or miss out on salvation or their restoration with God because I'm busy feeling bad about it on the front end? So weigh the urgency of the situation, right? We can be stricken with grief and immediately get to work. We can grieve during the process, right? Those families in Western North Carolina hit with something earth-shattering for them. They're still getting to work. They might have needed a couple brothers and sisters to come along and help them get to a place where they could get working and rebuild their community. But they had to work while grieving. And that's okay. Because every time you come across another life that was lost or another home that was destroyed, that should cause you grief, but it doesn't need to make you stop. But at the end, we need to close the book on that grief. If we weren't allowed to be grieving on the front end because of the urgency of the situation, or because we were too critical in the situation of fixing it in the moment and addressing what was wrong and broken and getting people back to God in the moment, we have to close it out with grief. We have to, it's not about burying it down and say, well, I missed my opportunity. The labor's done. The ship's been fixed. The fire is out. I need to weigh the totality of what's been lost, what's been hurt, what's been broken, what's been missed out on, that we've offended God. And I need to mourn that. We should do that. That's healthy. There's just a healthy way to do it. And at some point, we need to close the book on that grief. Say that chapter's over. It's not that we can't go back and acknowledge it or talk about it or help somebody else process it, but we say, you know what, the time for grieving this is over. I'm gonna focus on the celebration of what God allowed to happen in that his grace was so big that no matter how far I got from him, he allowed me to return. That my family was falling apart. We were holding on by a thread and he knit us back together. And I'm gonna declare his goodness and his greatness and his sovereignty over that situation. Instead of focusing on all that was lost, I'm going to look at all that he bothered to save. See, I think God is, in fact, pretty confident, God is far more concerned with our response to grief that we even bother to grieve at all. But grieving is important. I don't want to diminish it. It has a role. We have to heal, and we have to do that smartly. All right, so wrapping up. For the importance and the value of taking responsibility, ownership is key. Nehemiah would not have accomplished what he did. He would not be recognized for what he accomplished. We would not know that he's a leader of anything. The story of God moving in this situation and God moving even through King Artaxerxes would not be known had he not taken ownership of the situation. So he took ownership. This is key. It allowed him to bless God. It allowed him to please God and return to him. But see, it wasn't until that grief became so personal for him that it became powerful enough to move him. He didn't just say, well, that's the breaks. That's what we get. That's who we are now. This is our circumstance. He was grieved in a way that was so personal. He said, I can't stand it. I can't stand it for me, for my people, what it means for us, what it means for the next generation. I want what was rightfully ours back in our hands. So be ready to take ownership of your relationship with God, the accountability that you need to hold others to, and faith goals. So another recap here is work with authorities, not against authorities. All authority is ordained by God. He has set everybody in a leadership position over you for a reason. Now, their abuse of that leadership or their misuse or their neglect of that leadership, that's on them, and they'll be dealt with for it. They will answer for their misuse of authority they were given. But remember that it's not just okay with God that you would work with those authorities. It's within his expectations that you as a Christian, you as a disciple, you as a Christ follower, you would submit to and work with every authority over you as much as you absolutely can. There may be a time for resistance, but I'm less and less convinced that that's our walk and what it's meant to be. He wants us to work with authorities. And when we honor his authority and those that he's put in authority, that authority responds in an honoring way. So also allow yourself to recognize how God works through people that aren't even his people. Non-believer. King Artaxerxes, not a believer. Not under his religion. That's not his custom. That's not his city. He could care less. But God let him work through him anyway. He allowed him to be generous in that moment and bless his servant. So remember that planning brings clarity. So taking time to plan is going to bring clarity to your mind as the leader of the situation. Or maybe you want to get rid of the leadership aspect as soon as you can, and you see somebody more qualified and capable and they've taken responsibility too. You share your plan, you hand it off maybe. I don't know. But providing that clarity for you allows you to express clarity to others. Everybody that you want to bring along in the rebuilding and the returning to God. And remember that, I'm sure most of us have heard this before, failing to plan is planning to fail. So we don't just say, hey, let's go. We create the plan for the clarity it provides. Vision, casting that vision is what invites the increase. It invites the increase through collaboration and cooperation with everybody else who you have the ability to spark a passion in. Who you're expressing your vision because of your shared hurt, your pain, what you're experiencing. They want to go with you. You're selling hope at that moment. And with that, as you bring more, that's where the increase doesn't just add up, but it multiplies. And in doing this, always, always, always proclaim God's role in this. Give him credit, give him glory and honor and praise for what he is doing in that moment, allowing you to return to him in the first place. And lastly, lead by example. So Nehemiah didn't say, all right, guys, let's have a town meeting. Let's talk about this thing. The dude was in motion. The second he was allowed to go, he went. He was patient. He was kind. He was humble. He waited on authority, all those things. But he led by example. And when you say, come with me, guys, but you're still sitting in your chair, it doesn't come out the same. For you to already be moving and say, guys, I'm going, let's go, let's get this thing done. People join in when you're leading by example. You've convinced them you're already going with or without them. Here's the funny thing, like anything less than already leading by example when you want to try and lead others and welcome others and invite others to that vision, anything less than already going is hypocritical. So it doesn't matter if, just like Nehemiah, it doesn't matter if you're a trusted leader, if you're a tested leader. He was a trusted servant. It doesn't matter if you've got that under your belt or not. Some of us have been in leadership roles for a significant portion of our life, and we're still bad at it. Some of us have never tried it, and we might be blessed just because we're following God for no other reason. So it doesn't matter if you've been tested in this before and you think you've got leadership qualities. It all started with ownership. It all started with taking responsibility. You can apply these lessons to whether you're backsliding personally, whether your family or your marriage is falling apart. You recognize that your community has lost its reverence for God, or your church is doing things that are sinful, allowing things that are sinful, or going so far off the rails that you can't recognize your own religion anymore. you don't have to be the oldest, wisest person in the room. If your eyes are open to what's wrong, that people are getting away from God, that they've abandoned God, that they have no love for him, that they've settled for a lower level relationship with the world, address it, speak up. See, here's the thing, like, you don't have to be qualified. You just have to love someone or something enough, or yourself enough, your soul enough, to want to take responsibility for the situation. It doesn't matter who got you there. It doesn't matter if it was completely your fault or partially your fault or somebody else's fault. Take responsibility for that situation and see what God does. So I'm going to ask you today, have you taken responsibility for your soul or your situation? Have you been waiting on somebody else above you spiritually to tell you that you need to fix something, that you need to abandon some sin in your life and to get it right? Or have you said, you know what, I'm going to work out my salvation with fear and trembling, and I'm going to take responsibility for this? It doesn't matter that my family or my friends or my church body has allowed for me to settle with this in my life, or to continue doing this thing that causes separation and division between me and God. I'm going to take responsibility at this point. It doesn't matter who told me this was okay in the past. I'm not going to bother blaming them. I'm going to grieve the loss. I'm going to grieve the mistake, but I'm going to get back on track. And anybody who wants to come with me is welcome to come with me. I'm going to invite you to that today. If you've assessed, you've owned it, you said, you know what, I got something wrong. I need to fix it. I want to fix it. I need help. If you need that, we're here for you today. We'll pray with you up front. We'll be praying for you guys for other things too. But if you want that prayer, if you want that support, if you want that wisdom opened up, you want your eyes opened up to see the things that maybe are grieving God right now and you haven't even recognized, you want to be willing to take responsibility for something going on in your life, you join us up here, we'll pray for you. If you guys stand, we'll pray. We'll send you out of here, hopefully more responsibly minded for yourselves, your families, your community, your church. Father God, we thank you for your clear example through Nehemiah of how to respond to grief, to turmoil, to seeing that we've gotten away from you, Lord. Thank you for showing us how you respond to our response, Lord. How you want to bless us. Thank you for showing us. Thank you for the word today, Lord. Thank you that you give us each other. That when we do cast a vision, Lord, that we can count on others to respond with us and join in, and we can go towards you together. Lord, I ask that you would open our eyes today, show us the things that are keeping us from you, show us the things that are grieving you, that should cause us grief, Lord, and help us to respond in a way that blesses you. Help us to respond confidently, Lord, and give you credit and glory and honor and praise for your involvement, even your opening our eyes, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Guys, if anyone needs prayer, we'll be up here for you. We have starting point and equipping point at 12:10 today. See you next week.